Hi and welcome to today's show. My name is Sarb, Johal, and thank you for joining me on my channel. Today we're talking about emoji and emoticons, the little smiley faces and other faces that you put on your emails, your messages and your social media. Today we're discussing whether we are actually influenced by those emojis such that they actually change our emotions. And I'm talking to Dr. Michael Phillip from the School of Psychology at Massey University, so stay tuned to hear more. I start by asking Michael how he became interested in this in the first place.
Sure. Well, my background is out of communication studies. And in communication, one of the things I became really interested in was the extent to which a lot of the kind of cues we use to behave and interact with other people are nonverbal cues. A lot of our emotional kind of intentions, but also sort of our social intentions are communicated nonverbally. And that really got me interested in the persuasion and attitude change literature around how we go about sort of changing people's attitudes, changing people's behaviors on an everyday basis. As I kind of pursued that in communication, I realized that a lot of that work was happening in psychology. And so I switched over to psychology. A lot of my work looks at how we use nonverbal expressions, whether those are facial expressions or behavioral gestures, use of space and things to negotiate our social interactions. But the idea of emoticons is a quite interesting one in that it's very much a nonverbal medium that happens in a verbal medium. It's sort of this conjunction of the idea of having symbols and text that we're used to typing, but it's not decoded. Our brain doesn't see it as text. We see these emoticons as faces. And in fact, they're actually processed very differently than words are processed. And they have a lot of the features of faces. And so I had this conversation with some students of mine a few years back who volunteer in our lab here, and they got interested in it because, of course, these are emoticon natives now, these 20-year-olds coming up. And, and they're kind of, many of them are just sort of new to the idea of emoji as well. And so it's kind of that blending of these emotional icons. And they got interested in sort of how we process these as well and how we go about kind of communicating emotional and social information through these text channels, whether that's via texts on your phone or through email. And kind of seeing how they influence people differently than words and how much more impactful they can be.
Sure, because there's two ends to this, isn't there? There's the person who is writing the message or putting up some kind of posting on the web and their intention around their communication, but also the receiver as well, right? How that message impacts upon them, how they process that information. You mentioned a couple of things there, the emoticon and the emoji. So can you maybe explain the difference between the two?
Sure. Yeah, so emoticons are probably, if you're over the age of 30, you've probably used or seen an emoticon at some point in your life if you're using the internet, probably on email especially. And this is where, as you're typing along in a message, you might see a colon, those two dots kind of vertically aligned, followed by a bracket to the right of it, a closed bracket, which kind of makes then a smiley face turned at 90 degrees. Now, if you're kind of over 35 or 40, you're probably used to putting a dash in between that colon and bracket. And if you're under 30, you might find the colon dash bracket very disturbing. This is something we found as well. So there's a culture around creating these, but originally back in the, it was even before the 1970s. I mean, it was back in the 1970s, these emoticons started on sort of these local bulletin boards that people had set up when they were talking to each other. And these sort of emerged as ways of sort of giving the nonverbal kind of equivalent of a smile, that we would normally give in communication in a very kind of emotionless medium. And so we use that a lot now to kind of convey the intention of a message to help sort of relay the positive feelings behind it or perhaps negative feelings behind it, where the words might be a little more ambiguous. Emoji, on the other hand, are these very graphically kind of animated, almost animated. I guess some of them animate, some of them don't. But these orange round faces that look very much like smiley faces. They're indistinguishable. They're not text-based. They don't have the brackets. They're just these usually yellow heads that are smiling, frowning, increasingly doing all sorts of other things. And so the emoji are sort of the grandchildren of the emoticon in many ways, and then that's turned into a lot of other stuff as well. So emoticons, I think, probably are still around, but even if you try to type an emoticon into Microsoft Word or other programs these days, it'll turn it into an emoji pretty quick. It'll turn it into a little icon because it thinks that that's what you're looking for, is a smiley face, and trying to make it a little more compatible. So I imagine over time, these emoticons will become less popular as the emoji take over. But I think it's still interesting kind of at a emotion processing level, kind of thinking about the psychology of it, how the emoticons still have the effect they did, but also looking at sort of as people transition into emoji, what that means for sort of the symbols they're using and how those are interpreted, as you say, both from the sender and the receiver side of things.
It is interesting how rapidly it's changing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I've seen some operating systems now. I'm thinking particularly of the Apple operating system, the mobile one, which is what I'm most familiar with, is sometimes whole chunks of text are replaced by emoji. And it's not just facial emoji, it's other representations as well. So it's really interesting how that's rapidly changing the nature of communication. And as you say, I don't think we really understand how that's perhaps impacting upon the intention and how that communication is received.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the intention of the receiver, intention of the sender, but of course, as you mentioned, there's also we're now mediated sort of by the platform that we're using, and one of the kind of things you're finding with emoji is that different platforms sort of have different representations of these emojis. So underlying, there's a universal sort of code set up for these emoji, and each platform sort of has an icon that kind of correlates with that code. But of course, each platform doesn't have to have identical ones. And so recently, Apple switched its gun emoji to a squirt gun. It's much more sort of playful gun than other platforms use that use much more realistic looking guns, right? And so you can imagine the platform you use, if I send you a gun emoji from my iPhone and you receive it on your Samsung, it could have we could cross meanings quite easily and have miscommunications because of that. And I think similarly with the face emoji, how we can communicate emotional expressions, there's a lot of talk about what different ones of these mean, despite the fact that, they have labels, that are kind of underlying them. But do we all kind of make the same meaning out of them? And do people, especially when we're doing them cross-platform, do people, are there opportunities for misunderstandings?
That's really interesting, because I guess what you're saying there is that actually introduces perhaps more ambiguity into that communication. Whereas one of the theories that I think that you're interested in is that the intention around the use of emoticons is actually to try to reduce ambiguity to allow more effective communication.
Yeah, and I think there's a tension. There'll always be a tension there. You look at just the example of using a dash in the traditional emoticon. So you have a colon dash kind of closed bracket, which looks like a smiley face on the side, and the dash sort of stands for the nose. And over time, that sort of disappeared. And one of the things we found is that people who are used to the dash don't interpret the colon closed bracket as a smiley face as quickly. They don't kind of have the same kind of automatic response to it as a positive symbol as people who are used to the other way around. And so it does become sort of enculturated kind of an understanding. Those understandings become shared understandings in the group that use them in a particular way. And that becomes quite different to kind of our facial expressions, right? Which we learn quite widely, whether they're perfectly universal or not. They're quite broadly shared, the idea of smiles being sort of these affiliative gestures, these we put on a smile when we want to get along with other people, and yet kind of when they become these icons, whether they're emoji or emoticons, they have this more localized meaning in the group that we're sharing them with. And as you say, over time these get to be adopted in certain uses in groups, and when that kind of colloquially happens in a group, it may not be shared. That meaning more broadly, a lot of miscommunication can happen for sure.
So there's a couple of things that interest me in what you were saying. I was just reminded that I've come across sometimes people who use an emoticon the other way round. So rather than using the colon and then bracket, whether they have the dash in there or not, they actually use the bracket and then the colon. And through further kind of investigation, just from my part, it seems that seems to be more common with left-handers.
Oh, really?
They use that configuration the other way around. So there's an interesting detection that I've noticed, because I was really confused by it at first. I was like, what does that mean? But yeah, so there's cultural differences around how perhaps that's expressed maybe too.
Yeah, and that actually kind of points to another interesting thing, which is this idea of how we process faces. And so we know from a lot of the face processing literature how we go about perceiving a face and perceiving emotions in other people. We're really good at holistically examining a face, meaning we don't look at the individual features of a face. We take it all in at once, and we can make sense quite quickly of who that person is, the gender of the person, the ethnicity of the person perhaps, and also the emotional state of the person. We do that quite well all at once, not by looking at individual features of the face, but by taking it in all at once. And we know this because we can actually interfere with holistic processing quite well by simply doing things like inverting a face. So if I flip a face upside down, I become really bad at doing all of those things quite quickly. We just interrupted sort of our ability to holistically process faces. You can do it a number of ways, but inverting a face, turning it upside down is usually the easiest way. And one of the things we found with the emoticons is the same thing. If you invert it, if you do exactly what you described by doing the bracket colon, people don't recognize it if they're not used to it that way. They don't recognize it as an emotional expression, and the meaning isn't as impactful, right? Because it doesn't moderate the tone of the message in the same way as if it's the way we're used to it. And it's interesting as to how people then come used to using doing it that way. Is it a small group of people doing it that way, or people who are maybe new to emoticons that are, trying it out for the first time and don't realize there's sort of this sort of culture around which way you do it. Left-handed thing, I've never looked at the left-handed thing. That'd be really interesting to see. But it does. I completely identify with that feeling of feeling bewildered by looking at those the first time.
It's curious, isn't it? Because you could end up committing all these cultural faux pas by coming in, blundering in and using these emoticons, whereas actually perhaps there's a different set that's being used within that particular group of people or culture. And it also doesn't work that well, in my experience, where perhaps there's irony or sarcasm that's being expressed in a chain of emails. Often it may actually increase the ambiguity or can result in people actually looking a little foolish in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the variety of emoticons there are, I mean, you can use the semicolon, right, to make it wink in place of the colon. But then you look at the emoji and it's a sort of a numbing kind of a numbing number of faces and sentiment that you can send, and you look at some of these and think, I don't even know what this expression means, and of course then when you get one like that, you're not sure what it means, and of course people, to the extent, I mean, it becomes a very simple communication problem of sender and receiver. What is the sender encoding? What do they mean to send? And what is the what the receiver decodes is actually, don't necessarily need to be the same thing, and that becomes a really interesting then communication problem. Is thinking about how do we coordinate meaning between the two? Is it meant to be coordinated? Is it sometimes the fact that it makes us feel good to put people on edge by making them feel uncertain? There's a lot there.
Yeah, there is a lot there, and it really is that it's that relationship between the sender and the receiver, and it's been played out not just in the text but also the perception of what particular punctuation marks and emoticons mean, which kind of brings me on to what you were trying to do, I guess, in the work that you were doing, was to look to see what the influence of these emoticons might have upon the receiver, but particularly by looking at some physiological reactions that to a certain extent are beyond conscious control. Is that right?
Yeah, so one of the things that we look at, and being interested in facial expressions in particular, one of the things we look at is the muscles. We measure the muscles that people use to make facial expressions. And so we can use sensors called electromyography sensors. The process is called electromyography, or EMG, which helps us look at sort of the micro kind of contractions of muscles associated with the smiling or frowning and various other expressions. And what we did was we essentially monitored the smiling muscles on people's faces. And as we showed them these different emoticons to see sort of if people had these kind of automatic mimicry reactions. Now, of course, we can all smile volitionally. We can all put on a smile quite easily. But when we're not thinking about it, we find that, in fact, in positive and negative situations, we smile more, smile less in these muscles. And it may not be apparent looking at a person, they're smiling more, smiling less, but these muscles actually kind of charge up more in positive situations and less in negative situations. And so if we can monitor those muscles, we can kind of see these micro changes in people's almost propensity to smile or not smile in a given situation. And what we find is essentially when people see emoticons that they're used to seeing in the orientation they're used to seeing them with the configuration they're used to seeing, they do give an automatic smile within about 300 to 400 milliseconds. They reciprocate that smile very much like we do in normal interactions. And it's a mimicry response. We use these mimicry responses to help negotiate our interactions with the people. And if you give them a smile that they're not used to, if you give them emoticon they're not used to seeing, whether it's including a bracket when they're not expecting it, including a dash when they're not expecting it between the colon and bracket, or inverting it, turning it the other way, doing a bracket colon, as you mentioned, we see that people don't give this mimicry response. In fact, often you don't see any response at all, even after a good number of seconds, because people are still trying to figure out what it is that you've shown them. And this is different to showing people the word smile, for example. So we show the people the word smile, and we don't see the same response. So this is very much a response that's similar to looking at other faces, and that's sort of interesting.
It is interesting to me because, I guess the underlying idea here is this idea of contagion of emotion, that you can actually stimulate the receiver to experience a particular emotion through your communication, and not through the text of your communication, but through this mimicry of facial expression that they are cued to receive, either through some kind of innate process, as you mentioned, or through a learnt process. They've learnt to group these bits of punctuation together. They recognize that as a face, and then they have this reaction in their smiling muscles that is signaling this contagion, this communication of emotion, and their experience of that.
Yeah, and ideally, it's not necessarily the fact that it's going to make everybody feel better about the things you have to say. Obviously, if you have a pretty dark message, it's not going to moderate that whole message and make people feel better about it. But I think it does give the sort of natural smiling that we do every day when we're communicating with people. It sends that same sort of feeling. I never used emoticons until I started teaching online. And you realize that, often you just need it there because there's a lot of times where you're offering constructive feedback and you want it to be taken in a positive way. And the emoticons help. Of course, the platform I use for online teaching converts it instantly to emoji, but that's okay. But it does, I think it's an important kind of thing that moderates, that helps to kind of regulate the meaning and kind of help people understand that they're on the right track, that you're not, that it's not being sent with no feeling whatsoever.
Have there been any experiments done, Michael, that you know of where there is a clash between the meaning and the emotion that's being, or perhaps generated by the text, and then followed by a contrasting emoticon that is quite clashing with that textual message, and how they are perceived, how the message is moderated by that? Are you aware of anything like that?
I'm trying to think of emoticon ones, and I don't know of any offhand. There's a lot of instances of nonverbal communication, examples of just other nonverbal communication in the communication literature that look at kind of your gestures and and tone of voice and things as you deliver news to a person, and having some clash between that, having a very negative message but conveying it in a very positive tone and these kind of things. And there's some evidence that the nonverbal kind of element of that really, upregulates, kind of makes it a more positive message. And I think that's been, whether true or not, there's this notion in the communication literature that, the nonverbal signals are in fact kind of the majority of the meaning conveyed in any piece of communication. So it's very difficult to talk to somebody and give positive news without any sort of positive affect or expressions. It's not taken as positive then. And I think that's probably the important thing here. I don't know how much they can conflict before it seems just insincere, or, as you were talking about before, sort of sarcastic. But I think it matters a lot. That'd be an interesting study.
Yeah, I think it does matter a lot. I mean, I guess the things that are popping into my head are often people who struggle with communicating around things like change management. There may be a top line where this is going to be beneficial for the business or the company or the organization, but actually when you work it down, there are some quite serious changes perhaps that might be experienced. And how that's the message is nuanced, but also perhaps followed up inappropriately or appropriately with kind of non-verbal emoji, emoticon kind of messages through emails, inadvertently or purposefully. I mean, I think it would be really curious, and I'd be very curious to see how that's received.
Yeah, I can speak from a completely what I thought was unrelated, but seemingly related now, area of interest of mine, which is looking how we make sense of other people's expressions. And one of the things to look out for in that situation that we find is that people who are kind of low in feelings of belongingness, people who might be being exploited or feel exploited, have a stigmatized identity in a social group, they actually are much better and keener at distinguishing more sincere and less sincere emotion in other people. And so one of the things you always look out for is this idea that, people get kind of cynical when they're feel like they might be taken advantage of, or they might be sort of in a low power situation. And in these cases, I think the sort of attempt at positive emotion expression without any sincerity behind it can backfire in people. And I think that's always something that's gotten me quite interested recently is looking at sort of those instances where we try to put on a fake smile to comfort somebody, but it actually makes things worse because a person can tell that it's not a genuine felt emotion. And I wonder that about emoji too, if that can sometimes, there's so many variants of these emoji. Can they backfire if they come across as insincere?
Sure, I think you're right. I think we're really good at sniffing that stuff out. And if the purpose of the emoji is to reduce ambiguity, often I think if it's used contextually insensitively, it can actually reduce ambiguity, but in a very in a way that counters what you were actually intending.
And it has everything to do with coordinating that meaning. And I think that's the important thing is, as a sender, realizing that, you're in the meaning you're trying to send is you're trying to coordinate that with other people, and they may actually need to see something or hear something different than what you want to say in order for them to understand what you want to do, or what you want, the meaning you want to convey, which is always hard, right? And that's this is why I think you can't, you can't participate in online media these days without kind of understanding at least basics of emoji and emoticon and what means what, because otherwise you're out of touch and you're not actually going to be able to communicate with large swaths of your online community now. And that's that can be really confronting to people who have never used these iconic representations of emotions before, and other things.
Sure. So if we think about the basic findings here in the research that you're doing, this idea that the emoticons seem to be processed in a similar way to faces. They have this kind of configuration that people recognize quite immediately, and it provokes this mimicry response on their faces, this spontaneous smile if they see another smile, if it kind of makes sense within the context of the message as well. So who should care about something like this? What's the point? What are the implications of a finding like this?
Well, I think it's a good question. It's an interesting thing for the students who are studying it because they're using it all the time. And so this is on one hand, it's so long as it's interesting to the students who are kind of learning about psychological research and learning to ask these kinds of questions. I don't care what they do, as long as they're interested in finding questions that are relevant to them. On the other hand, I think it gives us some food for thought in using these icons in our everyday lives. It gives us a sense that they perhaps can't be used, that when we use them, we have to be using them very deliberately and understand the community that we're using them with. We can't, they're increasingly becoming very localized languages of their own, but with that said, not languages, and that they're being processed more fluently and more emotionally than language perhaps can be. And so I think it's about being deliberate with the use of them, realizing that not everyone's going to be using them as fluently as we are, if we're, especially if they're coming from a different community than us. And I think so probably at the end of the day, it's about just being very deliberate and considerate in the use of emoji and emoticons. And perhaps trying to be more understanding of faux pas that people might make in the use of them. I think there's a lot of, increasingly there's news stories about, miscommunications with emoji or the representation of certain emoji representing certain causes, whether that's the alt-right or whether that's the crying emoji that people are increasingly calling out as being very inconsiderate Schadenfreude emoji that people use to kind of laugh at others' pain. And these are all really interesting because, of course, they weren't designed to mean these things, but they're being used in a particular way. And not everybody realizes that. And of course, those are instances of emoji use that are probably more universal than most. And so I think it's just opening the door to a lot of questions about the use of these things in everyday life.
I think you're right. I think for me, the evolution and the change from the emoticons, where you kind of had to learn to group those things together, and the more you did that, the more quickly you responded to them, it seems that you're saying. But that's changed now to these emojis, which are much more direct representations of faces that we recognize without having been exposed to this kind of acculturation of what a colon and a bracket look like together, what that means. So perhaps, we're much more quick to react in an emotional way to these emoji now than we would have been to those emoticons. So perhaps we're entering into this new phase, like you say, where these emojis are deployed for purposes that are very different to what the actual facial representation appears to mean.
Yeah, but I think one of the kind of universals here across emoticons and emoji is this idea that these graphical these graphics, these icons stand out quite a bit. They stand out more than words. There's this interesting phenomenon with language around, we can't not read words when we see them. It's always kind of one of these horrible things of being on Twitter is, having spoilers spoiled for you by simply accidentally looking at a tweet, right? And you can't unsee it once you've seen the words, right? We automatically read words. But what's interesting is that I think these icons, these emoticons and emoji actually stand out even more obviously, and we can't not see them when they're in a piece of text. And so that smiley face at the end of your message to somebody, whether it's an emoticon or emoji, it's almost certainly processed well before you get to the end of the message. It'll stand out. It pops out to us, just like faces do. We have face effects where we see faces. We readily see faces in the world around us, even if they're not really there, right? We look in the clouds and can see a face, or lots of good instances of that. And I think one of the interesting kind of uses of emojis and emoticons is that they can accent a message. They can draw out particular ideas, particular emotional sentiment quite quickly and readily as a person looks at a piece of communication. And I think there's probably a middle ground there where too many emojis sort of ruin it, make it hard for us to kind of get that, that it turns it into something else. And I think there are lots of popular kind of games of, turning entire messages writing entire message with emoticons, but that takes a lot more work, I think. Whereas, kind of accenting your message with the important bits highlighted with emoji or emoticon is probably a really useful way of conveying sentiment. But this is maybe an old man speaking, and it might well be that in 20 years my son will be writing everything in emoji and will understand it perfectly. But I think at the moment, at least, thinking of them as accents, as emotional accents, meaningful accents that convey ideas perhaps more emotionally, more strongly than the words themselves is a really useful way of thinking about them.
That's a curious analogy to me. Let's stick with that emotional accents for a second, because often if we hear an accent, we can become a little bit curious, or maybe even slightly obsessed with trying to figure out where that person's accent is from, and we may not actually pay too much attention to the content of what they're speaking about. And I'm just thinking about the emojis. Is there any evidence that perhaps if, say, it was located at the end of a tweet, we prioritize looking and decoding that information, and then we actually kind of perhaps lose the content, or the content is then imbued with the tone of the emoji that we've actually processed with priority?
Yeah, I can't say anything in particular, but I almost certainly assume that's happening. I mean, and I think especially in a small, short piece of communication that has a smiley at the end of it, where we can look at the whole written segment, and we see an emoticon at the end. That emoticon will pop out well ahead of time, and ideally does trigger sort of a particular frame of mind, does trigger a emotional context for the tweet or whatever we're reading. So I have to believe it's so. I haven't done this yet, but I think it's worth looking at for sure.
Hi, thanks so much for watching today. My name is Sarb Johal. Don't forget to subscribe if you've enjoyed this content, and you'll hear more about what we've been up to on this channel when it comes out. Thanks so much, and go well.